Hi, Frank.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm all right.
Good. Now, is it true that your headset isn't working, so you're using one of those clunky handsets?
Yes, I'm going back to the old unfashionable telephone.
Which your son has ridiculed in the past.
Yes.
Uh-huh. And actually, I'm a little embarrassed to be seen alongside you, frankly, but I guess we don't really have a choice at this point.
Right.
As we record this, we're on the verge of the Florida primary. One thing I wanted to talk to you about today is the foreign policy implications of various people getting elected president, Democrats and Republicans, but maybe because of the Florida primary, we should start with the Republicans. I guess if we're going to say anything about Giuliani as a possible president, we better say it today, because it looks like 2 days from now nobody's going to want to hear about that.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yes, if I were him, I would fire whoever suggested this Florida strategy. In a way, it means that some of the ideas that he stands for never actually really got to be debated. But I do think that in a certain way, he was the leading neocon candidate, and if he goes down on Tuesday, this is going to, in a way, close off one avenue for their return.
Well, kind of. I'll actually kind of challenge that in a second, I think. But first of all, what do you mean about some of the ideas he stands for that have not gotten debated because he waited so long?
Well, he said in his campaign speeches that if you want to stay on the offense in the war on terrorism, vote for me, and has built his entire candidacy out of a kind of morbid 9/11 nostalgia, saying if you liked 9/11 and everything that happened since then, you'll get more of it with me, and has really not broken with any of the Bush administration track record from the past 7 years now. Unlike someone like McCain, who, although he supported the war initially and supported the troop surge, has been extremely critical of the Pentagon's handling of the war and the lack of preparation and what it's done to the military and so forth. And so Giuliani has just staked out this completely unapologetic position. And I think that one of the issues for all Republican, the problem is in the Republican primary, they can't distance themselves from the Bush legacy, but I think in private a lot of them understand that it wasn't that great a legacy, and I think that in a sense what the party really needs is to stand back a little bit and have time to think over what out of the past few years do they really want to carry forward into a new era.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's true that Giuliani has been the candidate of the neocons and has had the lion's share of the neocon advisors on board. On the other hand, since Giuliani started fading, the neocons have been making very favorable noises about McCain, and moreover, he was their guy in 2000, right? They were quite enthusiastic about him. And one thing I'm wondering is you had not really made your break with the neocons yet fully in 2000, so maybe you have some insight into what it was that they found so appealing about him back then.
Boy, you're really calling on me to remember a very distant time in the past.
And one that you're trying hard to forget, I know, but...
Yeah. I think that, right, that's right, Bill Kristol supported McCain up to a certain point in that election cycle, and I think probably, he felt McCain was tough and George Bush was really not tested, and I think, they didn't anticipate the degree to which they'd be able to really influence Bush's thinking at that point, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it wasn't clear who Bush was going to fall in with foreign policy-wise during the primaries in 2000.
And that's actually something that makes him a little bit, attractive. I mean, I quite honestly don't intend to vote for any Republican this time around, because I just think they need to sit out the next few years and do that rethinking that I mentioned. But I do think that one of the dimensions of having experience is, in a way, a kind of psychological one, that if you really have been around for a long time, you have a much greater confidence in your own judgment, and therefore you're not going to get bamboozled by a bunch of bright policy advisors. And I think that was the liability of George W. Bush back in the year 2000 that people simply didn't recognize adequately. And I do think that of all the candidates, McCain is probably the least likely to be persuaded by bad arguments, simply because he's heard a lot of them in the course of his career.
I guess so. I don't know. I mean, were you a McCain guy last time? Were you a McCain guy in 2000? Have you had periods of active enthusiasm for him?
No. Well, I remember thinking back in 2000 that although I liked the fact that he didn't toe the line and could think for himself, he also didn't have a very good personality for being president, just in the sense that he's got this terrible temper and speaks, not with great deliberation on all occasions, and just didn't seem to have the right presidential demeanor. Now, if you think that that's bad, you should see Giuliani, because I just think temperamentally unsuited to be a chief executive. But so I think those were my reservations 8 years ago.
Yeah. But I do think the neocons are definitely warming up to McCain. I think he is now the official de facto neocon candidate. And I guess I had always I kind of wondered whether their enthusiasm for him has been so pronounced and in a way not so obvious in its origins, that I've always wondered whether, he had some kind of talks with them in private, and they knew more about him than we do. But I guess you don't seem to recall any secret.
I think various people have been talking to him, and he's consulted. I mean, he's not been at all reluctant to consult them, along with a lot of other people. So, but I don't know whether there's something more specific than that.
I mean, what do you think we would get out of him compared to out of Romney, foreign policy wise?
Well, that's hard to say. It's impossible for me to figure out what Romney would stand for if he were actually president, and in fact, it's a little hard to understand what any Republican would stand for, given that they've had to distort their record to such an extent in appealing to the base of the party during the primaries season. For example, I mean, one thing I think that would be positive is that although I believe that he, in the end, caved in, McCain does have he is on record as opposing torture and, did make an effort with Lindsey Graham to force the Pentagon to, adhere to at least some rules, whereas Mitt Romney famously said that he'd double the size of Guantanamo. Again, that's that's positive in my view with between the two of them, because I do think that one of the big symbolic things that I would like to see done at the beginning of any new presidency in 2009 is it's a very clean break from the past policy of torture and prisoner abuse.
Yeah, and I guess pledging to double the size of Guantanamo is one of those pledges that's kind of hard to back entirely away from. I mean, it would be hard for him to turn around and now shut down Guantanamo, I guess, as President Romney, that is.
Well, with him, it's true on quite a lot of issues. He's going to regret things that he said during the primary.
Other foreign policy issues, you think? Because I actually don't think Romney, by true, in his heart, is really probably all that far right on foreign policy. I think, I think his positions are a product of political calculation in the way that a lot of politicians are, but perhaps more so. No,
I think that's right. I mean, I think he was probably, by inclination, kind of a Rockefeller Republican, but he's felt that he's had to take these very strong conservative positions in order to get the nomination. So,
Whereas McCain can be prone to flip-flopping as well, sometimes as a result of political calculation, but I almost get the sense with McCain that sometimes it's a question of mood. I sometimes think that McCain doesn't have policy ideas so much as he has policy moods, kind of.
Yeah, he's an irascible fellow.
He'll just get a bee in his bonnet about something, whether it's campaign finance or whatever, and take a strong stand, and the rest is history. And I guess that worries me a little, that some utterance he might make in the heat of the moment would become official policy for 4 years. What's funny about him is, I don't know if you remember, but he's now thought of as a big hawk and interventionist, and certainly has been that in Iraq. But he was against intervention in Bosnia for quite some time. Mm-hmm. And I remember, because I was in favor of it, and he was almost, people were thinking he represented the remnants of isolationism in the Republican Party or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that he does not have, to the extent that the neoconservatism has this idealistic crusading side with regard to democracy promotion. Well, actually, now that I think about it, though, he has been on the board of the International Republican Institute, which is the Republican Party's democracy promotion arm. And so, at least by that ex officio position, he must take that seriously. But I think that's not something that anyone would associate as his first priority in foreign policy.
No, although he's also come around more on humanitarian intervention. He did finally fall in line on Bosnia, and since then, now he's big on intervention in Darfur. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of what I mean. He has these radical changes of heart that make him, I think, more genuinely unpredictable than a person whose flip-flops are a product of sheer political calculation. And I actually looked up some stuff he said when he was still opposed in Bosnia, and I don't think it actually speaks all that highly of his kind of strategic judgment. I mean, he in 1993, he said, somebody said, is Bosnia like Vietnam? And he didn't want to kind of say that. But he made an almost analogous argument. He said, I think you can draw a parallel to the military challenge in Bosnia with what the Russians faced in Afghanistan. Even with ground forces and with overwhelming air superiority, they were unable to defeat a motivated, very capable enemy. Well, it seemed actually pretty clear at the time that one thing we had in Bosnia that the Russians didn't have in Afghanistan was an indigenous force that was, in fact, highly motivated and whose goals were allied with ours. That is to say, the Bosnians, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they wanted the Serbs off their land, and so long as we provided them enough air support, they could do much of the rest. So it wasn't anything like Afghanistan at all, and that just makes me wonder about...
yeah, although you don't know whether that was what he really thought or whether that was just a convenient excuse for not intervening.
Yeah, I mean, I almost think it was a convenient excuse for not being accused of having, lingering Vietnam syndrome, and maybe that was what he actually had. Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of people at that time that actually thought that, Bill Odom was calling for 500,000 men, sent to the Balkans back in the mid-1990s. So, the military judgments were sometimes not all that accurate.
Yeah, well, and I think McCain is kind of part of that school in the sense that he's a believer in, if you're going to do it, do it. And that may be a little bit of a holdover from Vietnam. Once you decide to go in, give it everything it takes. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. It does also just seem to me a little ironic that he was pretty much the official candidate of the neocons in 2000. They probably more than any other distinct DC policy school helped get us into Iraq. Iraq is now widely recognized by pretty much everyone but them as a disaster. It would be kind of ironic if they got their man in the White House,
Yeah,
in the
it could happen. It could happen.
Could well. I mean, if I had to vote on, if I had to bet on one Democrat or Republican right now, I mean, of course, the odds are not over 50% for any of them. But if I had to bet on any given Democrat or Republican to be president, I'm not sure McCain wouldn't be the guy at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think he does reasonably well in a bilateral poll against either Hillary or Obama. So I think he is a threat. No, and he's clearly the most experienced person in the Republican field, and I think that's going to stand him in good stead.
Yeah, I think he's the one person who is both the favorite to win his party's nomination and very plausibly wins a general election. I don't know. So what do you think? I guess that about exhausts the serious Republican candidates. And I mean, Huckabee's an enigma anyway, even if we were to consider him a serious candidate, right, on foreign policy.
Yeah, I think he probably doesn't have very well developed positions, just vague instincts.
No, he told somebody that two people he reads on foreign policy are Tom Friedman and Frank Gaffney, and somebody said that's like saying you're in favor of both Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf. So what about on the Democratic side? Do you have a, well, first of all, do you have a favorite? Have you?
Well, I have. I don't think I could bring myself still to vote for Hillary, just because I think that, in a way, we need to get beyond the 1990s, and everything that's happened in the past, especially in the past couple of weeks, has made it pretty clear that you're going to get both Clintons back, for the price of one, as they said. And I just think in terms of the, as the Soviets used to say, the renovation of cadres, you just need to move a little bit beyond that.
Because Clinton didn't do a good job, or just because reruns are boring, or what?
Well, I think it's several things. I do think that there's an important agenda out there, both domestically and in foreign policy, that needs to be changed. And I just think that Obama has a better chance as a fresh figure without all of these divisive, legacies from the past, of actually creating a consensus around, health care or different relationship of the United States towards international institutions, or any of the things that you might want to have done. Of course, I think Hillary Clinton, if she gets elected, is just going to be, right from the beginning, dogged by all of these old hatreds, and I think although she has probably learned something from her, for example, from her early 90s healthcare initiative to be more consultative and open and so forth, I would wonder whether she would actually be able to get anything through, given that legacy.
Yeah, so for you, it's not so much their differences on, say, foreign policy in particular.
Yeah, well, again, Obama is really a little bit of a mystery in terms of what he would, and having voted for one mystery man back in 2000, I'm not sure that that's such a safe, such a safe bet.
So you voted for Bush, in other words.
Yeah.
It takes a strong man to admit that now, Frank. I really respect
Although
that.
I did vote for Kerry in 2004, so.
Well,
I repented.
A lot of us did
after 4 years.
Yeah, but that's good. That's good. That's progress that about half of America didn't make.
But I actually think that whoever I think in terms of substance, it's a little bit hard to distinguish. I think in terms of leadership quality, the one thing I must say about Hillary, after this big disaster that she suffered in Iowa. It was actually quite interesting reading the accounts. Everybody in her campaign was completely despairing and ready to throw in the towel. And she was actually the one that decided that she was going to take control and organize the theme. And, she then went on to win New Hampshire. And so, in a certain sense, I think this maniacal drive to become president, it sort of manifests itself also in certain kind of steely leadership ability that I think is a bit impressive, and whether Obama has that or not, time will tell.
So you think she's maniacal in a way that he's not, and that may be a good
thing?
Well,
I think she's, I think it was in The Economist, described her as having this Nietzschean will to power over the course of her career, in just bulldozing through all of these emotional minefields with her husband and so forth. And I think that's, that's actually one reason why probably a fair number of people would trust her with foreign policy leadership in the way that they might not trust another Democrat. But I think, Bob, there's another issue that we should talk about, which is actually the effect of the surge on either of them, because I actually think it's going to make life really tough for a Democratic president.
You mean once they're president, or in trying to become president?
Yeah, because I think what we're going to be trapped in for the next few years is this never land. We're going to go down from 160,000 to the more steady state 2030 or so. It's still going to cost us, tens of billions of dollars every month. And I think that it's going to be pretty clear that we cannot get out anytime soon if we don't want to see things go back to the way that they were in the period before the surge, which means extremely chaotic. If that situation had persisted, I think it would be pretty easy for a Democrat coming into power to say, okay, look, things are so bad now, pulling out isn't going to make them noticeably worse, and so let's just get out sooner rather than later. Whereas now, I think the surge, in a sense, sets a baseline for this reduced level of violence, and if you do start reducing troops much below that, whatever, 120, 130,000 level, it's probably pretty likely that the level of violence will return to what it was earlier, and then there will be no question in anybody's mind that it's due to the decisions made by the new president. And so I think that's going to, then pose this really difficult question. You've got a tolerable situation that costs the country a lot of money, but, could go on for some time. Do you want to stick with that, or do you actually want to take the risk of making a much more drastic reduction? And I think that's really going to be the dilemma that will confront either Hillary or Obama.
Because they're committed to their base for a fairly rapid withdrawal.
That's right.
Yeah, but I mean, don't you think that the way these things work, I mean, they would be forgiven if they were withdrawing steadily but at a slightly lower rate than was anticipated?
Well, they will be forgiven by their base, but if Iraq then quickly slides back into chaos, I think that's going to be a real political liability.
Do you think it's also a political liability in the run-up to November, in the sense that I think both, of course, if the candidate is McCain, he was the pro-surge candidate. He was for surge before it was cool. And I think, both Hillary and Obama made very skeptical noises about the surge. Mm-hmm. So he will say he was vindicated, even though, of course, he was for the war in a big way, and that most people would say wasn't a great idea.
Unfortunately, the big question is what you do after the November election, and I think that's something that, because the level of violence has fallen and it's taken off as a front burner issue, nobody's really been talking about that in a serious way, but I think nobody really has a good vision for it, because, as I said, I think the country is just going to be trapped in this situation where we can avoid losing at a very high material and a somewhat reduced human cost, but there's also still no real assurance that you'll have a stable, self-sustaining government if you really do a radical withdrawal, and so you're going to be stuck in this never land, and there's no exit out of that that I can see anyone has really suggested, other than simply withdrawing and taking your chances.
Yeah, and you're saying that wouldn't be nearly the problem for a Republican, just because they can, without apology, keep the force levels exactly where they are?
Well, it's interesting, because I think even for a Republican, the budget consequences of this war are going to be pretty severe, because I think in terms of the economy, this downturn is likely to be deeper and longer lasting than previous ones, because of all of the structural imbalances that have been building up over the years that have to be unwound, and therefore, I think this open-ended fiscal bleeding, I think, is going to be pretty. Someone's going to have to staunch that at some point.
So the next president is in trouble regardless of who it is.
I think so, right?
Yeah. Okay. Now on the Democratic side, so as I understand you, you're saying that in terms of the actual policies of Clinton and Obama in the foreign policy realm, it's not clear that there are big differences in terms of their ideas about international institutions and so on. You think that Obama would better be able to mobilize the political support necessary to realize the foreign policy vision.
That's right.
But you don't think the visions themselves are that different. There seems to be a perception among a lot of Democrats that there really is a difference. That is to say, I think in foreign policy, Obama gets more support from the left than Hillary. Is that your perception?
Well, yeah, that's right. I think that Hillary has been triangulating all along. I mean, she made all these trips to Afghanistan and Iraq to bolster her credentials, and was willing to put Iran on the terrorist list and so forth. So I think in that respect, she has felt it important to burnish her more hawkish credentials. The extent to which she sticks with this, we'll have to see.
Yeah, well,
I mean, it's going to depend on things like how big a majority they've got in Congress once the election happens and so forth.
Yeah, I think early on she was almost assuming she was acting as if she was almost assuming she was going to be the nominee and beginning to position herself for the general election on foreign policy, and that moved her to the right. And it's unclear how much of that will prove kind of binding if she's elected. I think there are other reasons that the left favors Obama. One is just that if you look at the foreign policy advisors, both of them are drawing pretty heavily from Clinton advisors, as would naturally happen since that was the last Democratic administration. But more of Obama's advisors oppose the Iraq War apparently than Hillary's advisors. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is this sense that Obama, by his nature, will be good at doing one thing that didn't get done much under the Bush administration, which is truly appreciating how America looks from abroad. And I think the argument is both that, of course, he has an actually foreign background, for one thing, and also I think some people think that as a black in America, he's less inclined to look at things through the lenses of the American establishment than somebody like Hillary Clinton is. Does that argument make sense to you?
Well, yeah, it's hopefully that's true. On the other hand, his he's not terribly well traveled or experienced. I mean, apart from his personal biography. So I think we'll just have to wait and see on that.
Yeah. But okay. So, but you're an Obama guy. You're
by default. Yeah, that's where I end up.
Okay. Well, I don't think he's going to be using that as a blurb. By default, vote Obama. By default, Francis Fukuyama. Okay. Let's see. What? Any other thoughts on the presidential?
Well, I guess the other, the other part of it that I just think is going to be extremely important is dealing with all of the international economic issues. And here, I actually think the Democrats are going to do a lot worse because they've got all of the economic nationalists. We're in for this pretty tough period. You've seen this already with the with these Asian sovereign wealth funds buying up Citigroup and a lot of other American financial institutions. But there's been this huge shift in the distribution of wealth globally that we're going to have to contend with. The dollar, I think, is going to continue weakening over an extended period of time. And the responses to this can be sensible or not. And I think actually here the Republicans are probably likely to be more consistently internationalist, although that stance for them has been weakening as well.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Some of Huckabee's support, I think, comes from a kind of a populism that's becoming more kind of economic populism / economic nationalism that's infiltrated the Republican base a little.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess you're probably right. I mean, it seems to me the economy does, on the other hand, favor the Democrats during the election itself, right? I mean...
well, in the short run, sure.
Yes, it's not as if Bush himself is running. On the other hand, it's the party in the White House just tends to get blamed for economic disaster, and I don't know how disastrous it'll be by November, but it's looking like it won't be good.
But I think, again, repeating what I said earlier, but it does seem to me that what we're facing is not just another cyclical downturn as we had in, let's say 2001 due to some external event, but the unwinding of all of these imbalances. Basically the United States has been living off of foreign capital in a way that everybody recognized was completely unsustainable, and I think you don't correct those imbalances without permanently higher interest rates and therefore lower levels of growth and real sacrifices, and nobody's really had to make them until now with the beginning of this downturn. And so I think this really could be much more prolonged, and what you do about it I think is going to be much more difficult, because it's going to force sort of unpalatable changes that no American politicians really had to deal with in a good long time.
So you just think the next president is screwed regardless, more or less, it sounds like?
Well, they've got a big challenge on this front, I think, yeah.
And in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. It's not looking good on the economic front. Now, I saw on your on the American Interest website that you wrote something about Benazir Bhutto after her assassination, and you knew her a little?
Well, actually, we attended a class on Middle East politics together when I was in graduate school at Harvard, and so in a sense I've known her ever since then, and I actually ran into her a couple of times in recent years in Delhi, of all places, but I saw her, I guess, the last time in March, where she actually said some nice things. I mean, she gave a real stem-winder of a speech that I think was deliberately intended to appeal to both American and Indian audiences about how Musharraf had completely screwed up the war on terrorism, that really only a democratically elected government could deal with the terrorist problem, that she was very embarrassed as a Pakistani that her country was associated with terrorism, that she would repair the relationship with India, and so forth. It was a very powerful speech, and afterwards she asked me to come over to speak with her, and she said that she had read my last book, America at the Crossroads, about the neocons, and she said the criticisms were well taken, but on the other hand, the neocons still did have this idealistic belief about the universality of democracy, and that Americans shouldn't forget that. So it was quite interesting, actually. Now, in her case, it's of course this very difficult thing. She's also a terrific politician, and so she knows how to talk to the audience that she's addressing. And there are these other issues, long-term issues with her and her party, and this whole dynastic, class nature of democracy in Pakistan in the past. That's really been the reason why democratic politicians have never been able to survive in power, and how she would have dealt with that had she become prime minister again, I'm really not sure. But I do think it's a terrific tragedy for Pakistan that she was killed, because it leaves this huge leadership vacuum and a more fundamental legitimacy vacuum in this extremely dangerous, scary country.
Yeah, what do you think our policy should be there now? I read, I think in the New York Times recently, that the Pakistani government had rejected our request to get more involved in the frontier areas there.
I think that's a loser. I think,
You mean getting involved is? Or?
Yeah, I mean, blonde-haired soldiers show up in these tribal agencies where no Pakistani soldier has dared to go before, and they're somehow going to go after terrorists in a way that the Pakistanis themselves have been afraid to do. That just does not make sense to me. No, I mean, I think the administration's policy has been really kind of a disaster, because Pakistan, it is scary but the Islamist parties have been getting single-digit support pretty consistently, only up in the northwest frontier and in Baluchistan. There's a big middle class in that country, and it's not clear at all that the choice is, as the administration would have it, either between strongman Musharraf or a bunch of crazy Islamists. And as a result, they've invested virtually nothing in democracy promotion of the sort that would build a kind of liberal, centrist alternative to Musharraf, in the hopes that he would somehow hold the country together, without recognizing that he's been doing everything to undermine his own legitimacy. And so, in a way, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that when his legitimacy no longer can hold the country together, you really don't have much of an alternative. And so, I mean, we're really stuck now because of, I think, past policy that has not really focused on trying to create a democratic alternative.
Right, and apparently the Bush administration is very, very leery of the last democratically elected prime minister in Pakistan because of his Islamist tendencies. And he sounds like somebody, I wouldn't vote for, you wouldn't vote for, but what's your...
Well, he would know. Nawaz Sharif was not Islamist, he was just corrupt. I mean, that's been...
He didn't draw an Islamist...
Well, I mean, he may have in an instrumental way, but he was not, himself. He himself was quite, quite westernized. It just, his big problem was corruption. Now, I think that there's been a general... I mean, this is what's I find really disheartening about the Bush administration, that you had all of this unbelievably soaring rhetoric about democracy and how our security needs were now the same as our idealistic ambitions for the world, especially in the Middle East. This is what Bush said in January 2005. But in Egypt and Pakistan, they've completely, either they never, that was never their policy from the beginning, or they've completely backed away from any efforts that they may have made back in 2005 to try to create this democratic middle. And now they're stuck, with this reality that there are no moderate alternatives to these strongmen rulers. And I think this was just a terrible mistake on their part.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I recognize it's a tough dilemma that they perceive in these in countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, where you have on the one hand an authoritarian who will do business with you, and it seems as if the most vibrant alternative at the moment is this kind of simmering radical.
Well, but see, Bob, you got to distinguish between all of those countries. In Saudi Arabia, I think democracy promotion at the moment, apart from just a little help to civil society, is not that, it has very poor prospects. Egypt is different because they've got a fairly powerful Muslim Brotherhood. What their final intentions are controversial and, in many respects unknown. But the model where it's either Mubarak or the Brotherhood is a little bit more plausible there. Pakistan, I think, was quite different because there is no widespread equivalent of the Brotherhood in Pakistan. Their Islamist parties are really regionally based, and they're very small, and you actually did have a long-term democratic alternative. So I just think that we start from these abstractions like, well, I'm a realist and I'm therefore going to support stability, through a strong man, or I'm in favor of democracy promotion, and we're going to take whatever Democrat comes. And I just think that you need to look at the specific circumstances of each country and develop a strategy based on what's out there. And to some extent, you can shape that. If we had been plowing money into civil society and Democratic Party development in Pakistan right from 2001, I think we would be in a much better position to offer some kind of alternative to Musharraf now than we are.
Yeah, I think there's also, I mean, even if you look at Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, I think there's a tendency to assume that if a somewhat radical group came into power, they would not change at all, or maybe they would even get worse and more radical. But it seems to me that it does happen that actual political power and the need to deal with other nation states can have a moderating influence. It's always a gamble. But, you see time and time again the Bush administration very reluctant to take that gamble, it seems to me.
Well, it goes back beyond the Bush administration. It really happened with the FAIS, the Islamist party in Algeria, which won an election back in the early 1990s, and I don't remember whether it was Bush Sr. or Clinton was in power already at that point, but the United States and France decided that that was too big a risk to let them come to power. But I do think that there is a record, particularly if these parties come to power through control of regional or municipal governments, that the actual confrontation with actually having to take out the garbage and meet a budget and this sort of thing has a transformative effect. It's interesting, the AK Party in Turkey, the Justice and Welfare Party, which is this relatively moderate Islamist party that's now got the dominant coalition in the presidency in Turkey. The Prime Minister, Erdogan, was the mayor of Istanbul before he became elected prime minister. And I think that probably had some impact on that party's pragmatism. And so I think that, there's an argument to be made that actual participation in power does have a long-term moderating effect. And if you simply say, well, we're going to stamp out all forms of Islamism wherever we see it and not let them into the political system at all, you may simply be building, the ground for a bigger explosion at a later point.
No, I agree, and I increasingly just think I would be willing to kind of do the across-the-board gamble where you actually support popular will and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, it sounds like and it sounds like based on what you said, you might consider that an undiscerning policy.
In general, I think that that's a safer default position,
right?
Because I think people don't understand that the world has really changed from 40, 50 years ago, when you could get an authoritarian regime that could simply suppress civil society, keep out all of the other stakeholders, and hold power for itself. And I think in the Middle East, you've got civil society groups mobilized all over the place, and that's just not going to work in the future. So I do think that you've got to find a way to permit this participation and, as you say, let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, I think technology is making authoritarians a worse and worse long-term bet. Of course, when they have a lot of oil, they can hang on more than if they don't. But I think the other thing that technology has done is made it the case that more and more our national security depends on the goodwill of the people abroad. Whereas 50 years ago, it was a question of how the leaders of nation-states were aligned with us, and so long as every one of them either liked us or feared us, we were okay. I think cultivating goodwill is in and of itself more of a rational, national security goal than it used to be. So I think on both of those grounds, I'm just increasingly skeptical of cozying up to dictators, even when it seems the tempting thing to do in the short term.
No, that's right.
And the other thing is just the unpredictability of seemingly pragmatic interventions. I mean, just the phenomenon of blowback. Mm-hmm. You just see in so many ways. Well, I guess now I'm not just thinking about propping up dictators per se, but the kinds of things we were contemplating in Pakistan. Sending our troops in.
That's nuts. I think, in a way, what we've got to really do is look back at some of these earlier. Well, I mean, this is a process that's been ongoing for a generation now, but anyone considering doing covert operations or special operations in Pakistan, really ought to consider Guatemala and Iran back in 1954, because, in a sense, those were for many years regarded as, brilliant successes of covert operations, but the long-term blowback consequences of both of those, I think, were...
Right.
Were enormous. If Arbenz had come to power in Guatemala, you could have had the development of a more, given that it's a little country right on, very close to the United States, it could well have developed not into a Soviet ally, but into, a more democratic left, and you wouldn't have had this horrible generation-long civil war that killed so many people in that country. In the case of the Mossadegh coup in 1954, even secular Iranians that are normally pro-American still remember this with a great deal of bitterness. And so I think the consequences really are very great in the long run.
Yeah. Well, I think just to before we say goodbye, just to get back to the original subject, I think there's some thinking that in terms of distinguishing between Clinton and Obama, that Clinton would be more inclined to do business as usual in that regard. Mm-hmm. I mean, the American foreign policy establishment's instinct in situations like that is to go for short-term stability. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a possibly unfounded hope that Obama would just look at things in a fresh way and would be more inclined to identify with the aspirations of the people in whatever country was in question.
Well, the other thing is about Hillary and the triangulation. Bill Clinton used force, not massively like invading countries, but he used force as much or more as virtually any other post-war president. And part of the problem was that he felt that he always had to demonstrate his manhood, because Democrats were under suspicion as not being willing to be forceful enough. And I think Hillary has some of that same desire to prove her toughness. And I think what you actually need is someone that can say, well, actually, maybe things would be better off if we, if we didn't stir things up.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the case, that Obama may have a better chance of doing something like that.
He may. His national security credentials will be suspect on the right for reasons other than Hillary's, not because he's a woman, but mm-hmm. but they will be. On the other hand, and here, I just think you if you're talking about how these things are going to play out, you have to deal with some possibly sexist biases that are built into people's perceptual apparatuses, but it may be that people on the right would, or people in general, can accept non-belligerent rhetoric when it comes from somebody who exudes masculinity more easily. I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Hillary Clinton, I think, people perceive that she's got balls, so it would be true of Nancy Pelosi.
I will say she's doing a good job of covering that base. I mean, it's ironic that the first woman with a real chance to be president would have, in some ways, the opposite of the problem you would expect. Mm-hmm. Which is why that misty-eyed moment in New Hampshire, maybe one reason it kind of played well, because there aren't doubts about her masculinity. She's tough. So you're right. I don't know. There's a lot of possible bumper stickers we've come up with in the course of this. Vote Hillary. She's got balls. That was a good one you just suggested. Vote Obama. Not as bad as the rest is apparently your position. I don't think we're going to see that one coming off the bumper sticker presses at Obama headquarters. But we'll see. And unless you have any other thoughts. Maybe we should call it a day.
Okay, very good.
All right, thanks a lot, Frank.
Fun talking.
Okay, see you
Bye.
around.